Yeah.
but I see we've got some people gathering here in the audience.
Okay.
So let us officially start. So I would
Sure.
like to welcome everyone to the fifth Warsaw Independent Book Fair. We've got a guest with us today, Kim Stanley Robinson, a science fiction author. Among other great books, Stan wrote the Martian trilogy, which I believe is something everyone involved in social movements should read for reasons we will probably discuss in a couple of minutes. So, hi, Stan.
Hello, Amasia. Good to meet you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Let's go to questions. As I mentioned before, I've organized them in chronological order, so we will start speaking about the past. Before today, we spoke a little about Stanisław Lem. I think we'll agree he was a great writer with superhuman imagination and a grand skill in creating beautiful literature. And I can also see some similarities between his works and yours. The idea of what the first contact with aliens might look like, and the shared practice of making scientists important characters in his works as well as in yours. Was he an inspiration? What do his works mean for you?
He was an inspiration, and I've never stopped reading Lem and enjoying his work. You mentioned the alien contact, and I have to say that after reading Solaris, it seemed to me that the first contact story had been told definitively, that it couldn't be told better, and that it couldn't be otherwise in reality. So in truth, I've never written an alien story, partly because of Solaris. And when I did glancingly in Galileo's Dream, it's kind of a replay of what happens in Solaris, in that you can't understand the alien by definition, and it's likely to be big and other in incomprehensible ways. So but that's not all about Lem. You mentioned his scientist protagonists, but also the way that he played science fiction as a philosophical game for dealing in ideas by way of plots in
Mm-hmm.
interesting ways that made them into literature. And he wrote a couple of very influential articles on Philip K. Dick, and he liked Philip K. Dick, but felt that Dick was not serious, but was distorted by the crushing pressure of trying to make it a living in 1950s American science fiction. So his articles were quite critical of American science fiction as being pulpy and essentially not taking advantage of what science fiction can really do as a tool of thought, and just fooling around and doing stuff that could be done in westerns or any other kind of soap opera, and not using science fiction the way it could be used. And so I had in my own mind a thing called the Lem test. In other words, if you applied Stanislaw Lem's criticism to your story, would it hold up? In a kind of a theater of the imagination, if Lem were to read this story, would he give it his seal of approval of taking the genre seriously? And that's never left me. That has always been to me a thing to keep in mind, that although science fiction is highly entertaining, it's also got a power if you use it. And that's what Lem showed. So when I was a young reader of science fiction, I wasn't as young as some people. I was maybe 20 years old when I discovered it, 18 or 20. And the new wave was sweeping American and British science fiction. And what's interesting is that the translations of Lem and of the Strugatsky brothers were just coming into American science fiction by way of English translations. So there was a time lag there. And so works by Lem and the Strugatskys that had been written in the 1950s or the early 1960s, they were only appearing in America in 1970. And so it looked like they were part of the new wave. and the new wave was very concerned with the 60s, the Vietnam War, the drug revolutions. And so to have Lem and the Strugatskys as part of that crowd was a alienating and globalizing. It gave the new wave more breadth and more intensity, and there was no reason to exclude these writers. They looked like they were part of the movement, which is I think an accident of translation timing. But it meant that both of them, Lem and the Strugatsky brothers, were very important influences on my early enjoyment of science fiction. And I've read both of them, or all three of them, in English. In other words, if it's been translated into English by them, then I've read them. And Lem, of course, was very prolific. There's a lot of work. A lot of it was translated by an acquaintance of mine, Michael Kandel, whom I met once, and he did great work in that. Lem in English is really good. And the initial translation of Solaris into English had been made from the French translation, which turned out to be a bad one. So there was a really crappy translation of Solaris into English by way of French. And then Michael Kandel retranslated it straight from Polish. And it was a much more impressive literary achievement. So I think it was important to run into these writers when I did. Well, I was young, they were older, but their works were arriving in English right when I was diving into it and reading a lot. So it was important to me.
Okay, I mean, Lem test, that must be quite difficult a test, isn't it?
Yes, but you know, he had a goofy sense of humor. Books like the Futurological Congress or the Ivan Tichy or the two robot tinkerers, these are like folk tales. So it isn't as if he was always a deep philosopher, or maybe I should say he was a philosopher with a sense of humor. So I think the Lem test is a hard test, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, about the sense of humor, I read an interview with Stanisław Lem where he says that the sense of humor has to be there in his books because otherwise they would be just too dark and pessimistic for people to actually enjoy.
Yes, he has a nihilistic or a very dark, he's not a utopian thinker at all. I don't know if it's his individual character or the national situation. I mean, nobody can untangle those two. But he is quite funny often. And I think that it's a coping mechanism that works very well. You've got to see the funny side of things. And there's a kind of a grim hilarity, even in his book, Technologica Summa, his nonfiction monstrous encyclopedia, it just got translated into English about 5 years ago. And I read it. And what I noticed was that book is also filled with high humor. I think he was enjoying himself more in that book than in a lot of his fictions where he had to deal with the mechanisms of fiction and it was just something to get his ideas across. Well, in his book of ideas, he could just relax and talk about ideas. And so he seems in a very good mood in that book.
Okay, let's leave Stanisław for some time and talk about writing science fiction, because I think it's a common notion that science fiction as a genre is slightly biased towards the right wing. It's full of a lot of books, a lot of movies are based on the motive of alien invasion, where the invaders, need to be eradicated. There is a common conservative way of looking at the place of women in society. And even though the science fiction fandom is in general politically diverse, the right-leaning part is, I think, more visible. Do you do you agree with this observation? Do you think it's valid? And in general, what do you think is the place of politics in science fiction compared to other genres?
Well, it's more explicit and on the table in science fiction. Science fiction is inherently political. You portray a future society or a different society, and your underlying theories of history and your political leanings are immediately made obvious. So it's an allegory. They're all political allegories. Now, I would say I think science fiction has the full spread of politics. And the perception that it leans towards the right is partly the human result of it's very hard to imagine things that are truly different. And when you do, it looks weak at first. But also the fame of Robert Heinlein in American science fiction, a right winger who was the most famous science fiction writer. Well, he was always opposed, and I mean explicitly opposed, by Asimov and by Clarke and by Bradbury. And I don't think Frank Herbert has much of a politics because he's so stuck in the story of Muhammad and of empire. So he's writing a kind of fantasy, really. So there is a very vigorous right-wing science fiction subgenre, military science fiction, and it does well, but I don't think it does as well as, say, Le Guin, an obvious leftist, or that doesn't do as well as Ian Banks, an obvious leftist. And I think I hold my own there on the left wing of science fiction. So you have a right wing, you have a left wing, you have people who try to ignore it entirely. It's just like the rest of the world. And the common perception of science fiction for people who don't read it is often out of the movies. And so then you have Star Wars is like Dune. It's about empire, it's medieval, it's a fantasy. Star Trek is utopian left-wing science fiction from a 60s perspective, very silly, but very well-meaning. And Star Trek has the great image of the scientist in Mr. Spock, the perfect scientist without emotions, except he has lots of emotions. So, so science fiction in common perception is different than the literature, which is much more diverse and I think much more interesting. I'm a book person, I'm a writer, I'm not a film person, and so my prejudices are clear. But I would say that left-wing science fiction is extremely strong, and diversity, and I should mention, I'll finish with this, the feminist science fiction of Le Guin, Joanna Russ, James Tiptree, Octavia Butler. This changed people's consciousness. It's one of the most powerful strands in all of science fiction, more powerful than military science fiction by far, which merely reinforces old World War II ideas. So I would say if you look to feminist science fiction and you look to leftist science fiction, you see the really vibrant part of the genre.
So perhaps it's because it's always easier to imagine something that you know from everyday life, and it's easier to read about something you understand. So it takes like greater talent and skill in writing to actually imagine something totally different. And that's why if you go to a bookstore, at least that's what it looks like in Poland. Poland is leaning towards right wing more and more and more. So if you go to a bookstore in Poland, you will find lots of this military stuff, really loads of it. Sometimes with themes from Polish history. So, you know, Polish knights with laser guns fighting the Bolsheviks. This is something that people love. Although for some reason, in every bookstore which has science fiction section, there will be books by Le Guin. So yeah. Perhaps people are reading her books too, which is a good thing. I think it's always a good thing to read her books.
Yes. I'm thinking from what you say that science fiction, that all literatures work as national allegories, so that any novel is a story of that nation. And particularly when you get to Eastern Europe, or any nation that has a language that has only the citizens of that country know that language, then that language is under threat from globalization and from English. So there's a defensiveness and a nationalism that gets expressed through the literatures. And Poland's history, you know, being crushed between Russia and Germany, has been so military and so fractured.
Yeah.
The living memory of Poland's history is enough to make you defensive and militaristic. So those stories appeal, but there's also, you know, a strong strand of resistance and of difference. And that's where I think Le Guin is always popular, because she's about difference and she's about resistance to the powers that be. So there's always a revolutionary potential in every national situation. So you get the full spread. And the whole world right now is going through this, and including spectacularly the United States, this internal battle between nationalism and globalism, or recognition that we're all on one planet together. That's a shocking idea. And so it takes some getting used to, and that's where literature can engage it. And that's where science fiction is incredibly powerful as a way to allegorize all these stories.
Okay. And as we speak about politics in sci-fi, what is it that brought you to your ideas? As you've already mentioned, your books are political, and how did you get there? And was it difficult for you as a science fiction writer to get recognition in spite of left-wing politics clearly visible in your books?
It wasn't difficult. I feel like the spread is open to anything. If you can make it work as a story, the politics are acceptable to a broad range of science fiction readers. They like the idea that they are generous, open-minded readers, so that I have quite a few readers who will say, it's unfortunate that Robinson is some kind of communist, but his stories are good. I read them for the Mars, I read them for the space adventures, and I just ignore his politics, or I hope actually it has an effect on them. So I myself, I mean, I'm 68 years old. So I came to my college years during the Vietnam War, and was subject to the draft. I did not get drafted because of a college deferment and because I was just young enough. But the Vietnam War was a radicalizing event where when you realized that it was an unjust war, an imperial war, and you might say a stupid war, a mistake, and to resist it got me involved in left-wing politics right from the start, out of student resistance to the war. And that never changed. One of my teachers was Frederick Jameson, who is the most famous literary critic in America and a Marxist. And so he has educated an entire generation of academic critics who are my age, because he's now 85. He's changed the world by changing literature departments into social theory departments. So what used to be internal rules of poetry, like English departments of, say, the 1930s or 1950s, all English departments are now sociology departments, heavily involved in social theory, theory in general, and philosophy. And Jameson was a huge part of that. And he was my thesis advisor. I wrote my book on Philip K. Dick under his direction. So it was both my personal situation and also the education that I got, and just what I saw from literature myself. I mean, everybody makes their own decisions politically based on what they see and how they live, and on their class position, and then also on what they read. And so I've always been reading science fiction and political theory together. And I think it makes the fiction better to have a politics to it. So it's interesting that we talked about Lem before. Now, you can't really pin much of a politics on Lem because his philosophy is sort of, um, I won't say transcendent, but it's kind of the philosophy of the 19th century, pure ideas like what is consciousness and what is the other. He's kind of an existentialist at best. And so you don't see a political element in Lem, but then again, he's writing in Poland in the 1950s and the 1960s. Whatever politics he has to be coded into stories about aliens and group minds versus individual minds. And that kind of philosophical question, of course, has a political element to it. So everybody writes their politics in one way or another.
Not everyone is aware of that, and sometimes people try to hide it, which I don't think works really well in some contexts.
Well, you can't hide it. What would be the point? You could maybe think, oh, I'm fooling people into agreeing with my ideas, even though they wouldn't agree if they knew what I was really saying. Well, people aren't that naive. So maybe they are, but they're not going to be reading my books.
What I meant was more pretending that what you are saying is not politics. It's, the common sense, or it's just objective truth. So my books are not political. I just write it as it is. And the left-wing writers, they are just writing some fantasies. And this is about what the world looks like. I think it's very common in some of the right-wing fiction.
Oh, yes. No, now I understand you. Yes, this is a rhetorical stance that what I'm saying is reality. What you're saying is ideology. Yeah. Well, this is easy to deconstruct, but people still try that ploy. It's a common rhetorical stance to try to persuade people that your argument, your politics are the correct one. It's always worth attacking that. It's always worth saying that there is no common sense. There is a kind of a hegemonic theory that people agree to without realizing they're agreeing to it, that they call common sense. Gramsci's very good on this, and so you need a education in politics, but also an education in rhetoric. How do people convince each other? So the ancient Greeks are very good on that. And everybody, it's too bad that education doesn't include a solid class on ancient Greek rhetoric, just so that you know the games that can be played with your head.
Well, especially in the age of internet and social media and being exposed to people trying to convince you something while at the same time they pretend to be just regular folks expressing their opinion. But as we speak about politics, as we speak about the bit more modern times, let's get to the part of our talk about the present. Your protagonists, they represent a variety of identities and sexualities. Poland, however, is experiencing at the moment a crackdown on the non-cis hetero people. What do you think needs to happen for everyone to be accepted as equal member of the society? Like, for example, the protagonists of your book, 2312. And in your works, I know you've tested many ways of change towards better society. How do you think it's best to choose the right one we should take? And how do you think literature, with emphasis on science fiction, works in this context?
Well, I'll start from the back. Science fiction is a great vehicle or arena to discuss difference and to imagine what it's like to be the other one. Otherness is the question here. Diversity, other. Do you think your identical twin brother or your clone is the same as you? No, they're completely different. Everybody's different. And their choices about their sex life are private and their own business and should never be messed with by the state or by churches or society. So this is, I mean, I'm a Californian, and the capital of my region of California is San Francisco. So I come from the most advanced gender identity place on the planet. And I've met a lot of trans people and have friends and acquaintances, and the whole gay lesbian world is in San Francisco is the world, and is very involved with the straight world and with science fiction and with organizing readings. And it's simply the world that I live in. So in a way, I speak from a utopian space that is somewhat futuristic, and it's strange accident of history that San Francisco should be that way, and that California is a historical space that is quite interesting. Now, and I just want to say something that a young person in San Francisco said to me once: it's all skin. And you have to think about that for a while. If you're thinking about people with different gender identities than you as being somehow fundamentally or essentially different, it's all skin. And this was a person maybe 30 years younger than me, 35 or 40 years younger than me, just making a casual remark like, how could anybody get hung up about gender identities? It's all just skin. So who cares? And this was a profound thing to me. Now, I mean, bringing it back to Poland, you have the Roman Catholic Church, which was a part of the resistance to the Soviet imperial moment. And yet you still have a state that is somewhat, it's not a one-party state, but it's a highly authoritarian state. It's a state in flux that's trying to keep control of a population and trying to say it's common sense, like we were talking about before. So in that situation, then difference begins to look dangerous, and it's easy to rally people who are afraid of the other. Then you can rally them to your cause and get their votes by very simplistic rhetoric. Oh my gosh, it's us against them, and us has to be defended. So to me, the motives are clear, and the basic logical fallacy at the bottom of it of making any statements about gender identity is just, to me, it's another power play. The people are trying to exert power over other people. They might as well be the Soviets working against solidarity.
Okay. So what do you think can be done about this in such situation? Because it's obviously act of those at power to, you know, divert the attention from what they are doing, you know, stealing money and taking more power than they are supposed to. I think it's pretty clear and obvious. However, it works. That's a big problem. It works. And gay people are being attacked physically in Poland these days more and more. And how to resist? I mean, there are some theories saying that minorities who are seen as less capable of action or less threatening, but in a physical way, will be more prone to being attacked. It's because, you know, when if you live in Poland, you will read hate speech, you will experience hate speech aimed at every group you can imagine. There will be hate speech against them, and they will be pointed out and you know, turned into scapegoats. However, some groups are not being attacked, and some are. What can be done about it? What do you think?
Well, I first want to say that the situation is worldwide, and it's happening in the United States too, and that San Francisco and California are an enclave. And so I'm thinking about enclaves. You go to the city where there's enough people like you that you can band together and resist. You also have to, all the people who are being othered and being attacked as enemies have to band together as common allies in the same cause of diversity and freedom of being who you want to be. And then you have to do your best to work the feminist angle that what women do and think is critically important. And if they join these oppressive causes, that's the really bad sign. But because they're usually oppressed against too, they usually are a force for good and a force for tolerance. So banding together, and then this is my way. I'm a writer. I tell stories. You keep telling stories of things going well. You keep telling stories of the bad faith of the oppressors. That because fear is more immediate, it looks stronger than hope and solidarity. But hope and solidarity are really what keeps the world going. And so I guess what you would call this is phrased in English, the discursive battle, which I think means the battle for ideas, the ideological battle. But the discursive battle means the stories you tell, the way that you talk, the things that you point out, the way that you're political. And it, I guess speaking out, I mean, on social media, everybody's free to speak out, but then in person, and of course now during the pandemic, I mean, what does in person even mean? Maybe it's emphasized social media because we all are mediated now by our devices rather than meeting in person. So it's not much of an answer because it's going on everywhere and it's just an unsolvable battle. I mean, I think it's not going to end in our lifetimes because fear is so immediate. And when you're fearful, you think, who is my tribe? Who are like me? And that can be nationalized, like, okay, we're Poles. But if there's groups within Poland that are being oppressed by other groups, then you have to realize that fear is being used as a tool for political power. And so you have to, resist fear with anger. I don't know. We're in a fraught time. There is no easy solution except to fight.
I think some of the things you've mentioned are fitting very well into the next question, because I wanted to ask you about religion. As in most of your works, the protagonists are not really religious people. Neither is faith an important part of the story. However, some characters are religious, some secondary characters, or for example, the protagonist in The Shaman. They pronounce it right? Shaman?
Yeah, that's how I say it. Yep.
Okay. So he's clearly a, I don't know, religious or spiritual guy. And I noticed you don't really criticize religion or spirituality in your works. Even though, of course, we know examples of where religion was a tool of oppression or gaining more power over other people. Do you think it can also be do you think it can also be used as a tool for emancipation? And how does it work with the focus on science and scientists in your world?
Well, again, I'll start from the back. I have been thinking for a long time that science itself is a kind of religion in this sense. It's a devotional practice. You devote yourself to the study of the world, to see what's there, to see it better and understand it. And if you're like Galileo, you say, well, this is understanding God better. To understand nature better is to understand God better. And so he was a practicing Catholic. He was deeply offended when the church tried to accuse him of heresy when he was just studying the universe. And he made his defense, which is part of what got him into danger, by saying, no, I'm a good Catholic and this is what Catholicism is. And the power structure of the Roman Catholic Church said, only we get to define what Catholicism is. An individual Catholic does not get to speak on this issue. We speak, you listen, and you obey. So there you have religion as another political power structure. And, I was brought up a Protestant, a Lutheran. Protestantism says there is no power structure, it's just you and God, but it's a kind of a Christian religion. And in California, very powerfully, Buddhism became a forceful part of Californian life and ideology, coming over direct from Asia, from Japan. Some Japanese Americans, some Chinese, and some Californian of European origin going to Japan and coming back brought Buddhism to California. And it's a kind of it's not like Tibetan Buddhism or Thailand's Buddhism. It's not very hierarchical or strict. It's more like Zen Buddhism. It's you and the universe, and it's paying attention, it's being devotional, it's regarding the whole world as a sacred space, and then doing your daily routines as if those are the activities of a monk or a mendicant, someone who's worshiping the world by washing the dishes. So this is a kind of a hippie, new age California Buddhism that had a huge impact on me. And it's also occurred to me, and I've written about this, that scientific practice and Buddhist practice are remarkably similar in their ways. So I think we do have spiritual feelings. There's a big part of the brain that grew and evolved to feel that the world is miraculous and to somehow not fear death or cope with death, the knowledge of your own death, you cope with it. And it's a big part of your brain. It's very near when it goes wrong, it gives you epilepsy. It also can give you hypergraphia. So you get people like Philip K. Dick who have to write every day, all day. Hypergraphia is a dysfunction of the temporal lobe, which is right where the religious feelings are. So even if you look at it as a scientist, you see spirituality as an important part of the brain. Well, how do you fill it? And now I say you fill it with earth religion, with this planet as a sacred space that we have to take care of, or else the people in the future will be in trouble. It's a kind of a religious obligation to take care of the earth properly. So I wrote about that in Shaman. I'm glad you mentioned it. That the Shaman, it's funny because it's a Russian word or a Siberian word, so who knows how you pronounce it. You hear shaman, you hear shaman, only the Siberians know. But it was a worldwide religion because it's probably so old that it came out of Africa. In 100,000 years ago, when humans, Homo sapiens, left Africa, they had a religion already that was an earth religion that said that there were other realms, spiritual realms, that studied the world and went off into dream voyages and spirit voyages to try to understand things better. It was sort of an attempt at science. It certainly was an attempt to assign meaning, so that we were, with language, we were more than animals, or we were unusual animals because we had language and we had meaning, and the shaman would do that. So I thought it was important to write about that. It's very hard to write about it in the contemporary context without sounding too new age and too depoliticized. So I think you have to regard it as a part of your political stance, that along with everything else, it's justice is a kind of a religious position. And so that, that all beings have worth. This is a Buddhist phrase. And so that means that your politics have to reflect that and become kind of universalized. So this is the way that I try to integrate those two things.
But it seems that if you look at things that way, that basically, to some point, every existing religion can be combined with this attitude towards the world as God's creation, towards equality, which I think is very strongly emphasized in Islam. There is a scholar called Ziba Mir Hosseini. Again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. She writes, she's a Muslim feminist. and she finds that the extreme equality of all humans leads her to believe that women should be equals because they were created equal by God. So it looks like equality and justice can be achieved from very different and unexpected starting points.
Yes, and because you are in Poland, I think it's important also to mention the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Church includes liberation theology and a radical wing of justice for all that is not just South American. So I'm always bringing up Mondragon, a town in the Basque area of Spain near Barcelona, that is run as a cooperative, the entire town, as a tiny model of what the whole world could be like if justice were to obtain. Now, Mondragon was the idea, or was massively helped and started by a Roman Catholic priest who was sent by Franco to pacify the Basque region. And he's the one that started up the cooperative systems. And so I'm thinking that even in the Catholic tradition, there are concepts of radical equality and justice and liberation theology. And back to the Islam, I don't know that woman writer, but I read all of Fatima Mernissi, a Moroccan feminist woman who was very strong in the Islamic tradition and said that right back to Muhammad himself, that Islam has been more egalitarian, more feminist, less patriarchal than the subsequent power brokers of the Hadith and the caliphates, that they made it more power-centric and more patriarchal. And so these religious traditions, particularly Christian and Muslim, have been seized and used as tools of power when their basic ideas could be used as tools of justice. So again, the discursive battle. On every front of human thought, you have this battle.
It's a shame that those movements or those ideas within religion are usually left on the fringe, because I don't think they are very popular among the more important priests in every religion, because that basically undermines their position.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is one thing I like about the Protestant tradition, which in the United States devolves into or evolves into Unitarianism or the Quakers. The idea there should be no priests, no leaders, everybody in the church being equal because everybody in humanity is equal. And so this is one of, I mean, Lutheranism is just Catholicism in the local language. It has the same power structure. But after that, there evolved some movements of Protestantism, especially in the United States, that were part of the freedom and justice movements that actually changed the churches themselves. And they're small churches, but they aren't tiny. They are not cults. They've had an impact on American political thought, I think.
Okay. Let's go to a godless place now, or a bit less, I don't know, God-friendly. Let's go to China for a moment. Let's talk about China, because in your most recent book, because the Ministry for the Future was not published yet, right?
That's right.
So
next month.
Red Moon, okay. Red Moon is the most recent one, and a lot of huge parts of the book are about China. They're about history of China. They're about Chinese culture. A lot of the events occur in China. And well, China is not really known for their appreciation of the concept of human rights, especially seeing the way we see human rights. And it's also becoming a new center of the world, I believe. I think it's going to happen at some point that what the US used to be, China will be. Do you think that, of course, there is a reason to be scared because of that, but do you think there is also some beam of hope in this? I mean, the China in the Red Moon is not such a bad place, and some good things are happening there.
Yes, and I believe that. I guess I would start by saying China is so big and so various and in such rapid period of change that it's important to say, I don't understand China, and I don't think anybody else does either. And when I wrote that book, I had to express my feeling of not understanding, or else it wouldn't have been an honest book. So all kinds of things are happening there, and it is big. It's 1 out of every 7 people on the planet is Chinese, and they have a lot of problems that were created by European imperialism that they're still coping with and trying to come out of. So I think they do have a concept of human rights that is not as individualistic as European American and has to do more with the group. And when they took on capitalist practice after Mao, they didn't realize how quickly it would lead to inequality simply by the rules of capitalism itself. So what Xi is trying to do is a balancing act of keeping his society from cracking under the forces of capitalist inequality while still keeping the economic engine going and bringing a couple 100 million people out of rural poverty all at the same time. People talk about him as authoritarian. People talk about the abuses against the Muslim population in the West, and all that seems to me true. But there's also a Chinese phrase: when you're riding the tiger, it's hard to get off. And they are riding the tiger, and world culture is riding its own tiger. But China has a particularly crazy tiger to ride. And so as they try to balance all these things, if you are positive towards the Chinese culture as one of the great world cultures, and you see what happened to them from 1840 to 1940, the century of humiliation, as they call it, then you realize that since the Communist Revolution, enormous strides have been made towards modernization and towards the rise out of poverty. And also there's still a sense of the group. It's very easy to rally nationalism in China because it's very deep in their culture to think they're one of the great world cultures and that they were hammered for a century and now they're not going to be hammered anymore. I don't think they'll become like the American empire of post-World War II, which is to say 800 bases everywhere in the world, a complete financial control of the world. And essentially, although there was a Cold War with the Soviets, the US was so dominant in the post-war period that it became, the name globalization is partly a name for Americanization at the financial level and at the level of Hollywood and of stories, the soft power and hard power. China can't do that. In the coming century, there will not be Chinese military bases, 800 of them in 170 countries. So, but what they want is their place at the table as one big nation amongst the other big nations. So there will be the European Union as a kind of weird supranation. There'll be a United States, there'll be China, there'll be India, and there will still be Russia as a kind of a strange rump country of power. So there will be big powers. And what you'll get is an interesting world that I tried to write about a little bit in the Years of Rice and Salt. What if there's not a dominant power? What if there were 4 equally dominant powers that no one culture can dominate? The world gets more dangerous but more interesting, and it might be one step towards a more equal and just world. If you try to take the positive view of China, you can see them as just coming into their own and making sure that nobody ever pushes them around again. And we're not past the American century of financial power and of military power. In this world where America is so super dominant, for China, they have to act tough to clear the space for themselves. So that's what I think we're seeing now.
Of course, I don't believe the situation when there is one country, well, basically ruling is a good situation. But on the other hand, if we have a couple of countries, a couple of empires, that very strongly reminds me of the situation we had before World War I, which finally led to the war, because at some point there was nothing more to conquer, there was no more space to expand, so they tried to take from one another, and it ended, well, I think it ended terribly.
Oh, yes. It would be nice to avoid that, and important. And so, well, what do you see? You see a world where the wars like World War I and World War II won't happen again, because the weapons are so deadly that everything would be over and everybody would be dead in a month. So you won't have sheer repetition is not possible. What you'll have is hopefully think about the Paris Agreement and the agreement that we have to decarbonize the planet as fast as possible. Every nation on earth signed that agreement. It might become like the League of Nations after World War II, which failed to stop after World War I, and it failed to stop World War II. But the United Nations, although a very weak instrument and very much a statement of the Allied powers, it's been a framework for discussion and led to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, the fact that we all have to cooperate or we're all going to die. Well, that's never been as true before as it is now. It's more true now than ever. And it's always been true that humans have to cooperate or else famine will kill us off. And now that there's 8 billion of us, it's just the most extreme example of that case. What I take a lot of hope out of the Paris Agreement. Why did that get signed? Why did it get written? These are amazing world historical accomplishments. And so they're a sign, you have in culture residual and emergent. Residual is what resides from the past, and it's feudalism and it's hierarchy and it's religion as power and blah, blah. Emergent, you have maybe Mondragon, you have social justice movements, you have gender diversity, and you have this Paris Agreement that we're in an environmentalism. If these are the emergent world historical forces, well, they're going to have to fight, because the residual has a lot of strength and power. And it's almost a description of right wing versus left wing, but not quite, because some of the things that reside in us are always important. Family, the Paleolithic, hunger, the things that are biologically true are always residual and they'll always be there. So this isn't just a way of describing right wing versus left wing. It's a way of trying to get into the future without a mass extinction event.
Okay. I've got one question left for you, so I would like to encourage the wonderful people sitting here with us and some people on YouTube who are there to get ready with their questions. I will tell people on YouTube now, there is a chat you can use and you are more than welcome to post questions and I will pass them on. So let's get to the last questions I've got for you. Could you tell us a bit about your new book, The Ministry for the Future, as I understand? And it's supposed to be an insight into what exactly we can expect from Earth's response to climate change in the coming years. Am I right? It's not very optimistic, is it?
Well, actually, it's not the right word to use, but it is very optimistic. It describes a future where things go as right as you can possibly believe in. That was my task. So it's not a peaceful book. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of struggle, both discursive and physical, over the future. And so the notion is this, that And it's good. This follows on the Paris Agreement, that the Paris Agreement meets every 5 years to do a stock taking of how they're doing with their goals and their progress. And I postulate that at one of the very next Paris Agreement meetings, they decide they aren't meeting their goals well enough, and they establish a ministry. And this is allowable under the rules of the Paris Agreement as already written, to make a permanent subcommittee that is charged with defending the rights of the animals, the plants, the ecological basins, and also all of the humans that are generations to come, to defend their rights legally. And this turns out not to be enough. It's a kind of League of Nations moment, and things progress from there in the book. But what I did was I placed the book in Zurich. The ministry has its offices in Zurich, Switzerland. And I did that because my wife and I lived in Zurich in the years 1986 and 1987. And I just want to say on the side that during those years, we went to French science fiction conventions often. And this is an old association between Poland and France. When we went to French science fiction conventions, there were always a group of Polish people there from Polish science fiction. Dorota Malinowska was the editor at one of the Polish science fiction magazines who would come to France. She spoke French, she spoke English. She bought my stories for Polish science fiction magazines going right back to the 1980s. So I had that connection immediately with Polish science fiction from the time I was there. And this book that I've written now has given me a chance to write about Zurich, which is a city that I know and that I like. And before we go on, I want to also add that in those years, my wife and I we are fans of jazz music. And one of the 2 or 3 greatest jazz bands on earth was the Jazz Band Ball Orchestra from Krakow, Poland. So this was a group of 7 men who fell in love with American jazz when they were young. Louis Armstrong, big band, swing music, but especially Louis Armstrong. And so Jan Kudek was the trumpeter, and Marek, I forget his last name, was the trombone player. And they had a tremendous classical musical educations combined with a love of jazz. Well, they were the best jazz band in the world for a while, and they would come to California for an annual jazz festival. So we never went to Poland. We never saw them in Poland. We always saw them in California, but they were a Polish band. And the biggest concert they played was right when Solidarity was in the news and the Soviets had not yet gone away. So these concerts were, say, 1981, 1982, and they would come to California with a kind of a KGB agent who turned out not to be a KGB agent, but just a good friend of theirs. And they would play songs of the American resistance, essentially Black American songs of resistance under pressure. And so it was understood to be music in support of Solidarity, the political movement. And they would play these songs and get these amazing responses from American audiences who understood them as resistance warriors through the way of music. So I wanted to add that before we get into the other questions, just that I know for sure that I have had a lot of Polish readers from the 80s on, but especially with the Mars trilogy, because of the response that I've gotten directly from readers. And so it's a great pleasure to me because of that musical connection and because of Dorota and the whole relationship. It's been part of my literary life, but also part of my musical life. So, and as for my book, it'll be out next month, and I hope it gets translated everywhere. It's an attempt to imagine a good future, and that's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be peaceful. So it's kind of a chaotic book. It's long, it's crazy. And, that's what it is.
But that sounds like it's quite similar to New York 2140 in the respect that, like, some things change. The global warming cannot be avoided completely, but after things change, we can build on that and get something good going on.
Yeah, I'll add this. It focuses on heat waves. We've been taking for granted that the Earth is going to get hotter, but what has been recently realized is that the combination of heat and humidity is deadly. And you remember the European heat wave of a few years back that killed 70,000 people. And that was Europe, which is fairly north. The heat waves that are going to hit in between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, those will be deadly to the point that millions may die. And that's the radicalizing element in my book that forces change. To reduce global temperature means reducing the amount of carbon dioxide. That means you've got to fight the oil industry. You've got to fight coal, which I know in Poland is still used heavily. And the fight against them is going to end up probably being a physical fight, for sure a financial fight, for sure a political fight. So it's a pretty chaotic century that we're coming into. And so my book tries to reflect that.
I'm very much looking forward to reading it. And let's see, anyone would like to ask a question here? Say it in Polish and I will translate it to the computer in English. And then it gets to Stan in English.
Zastanawiam się, czy jest jakiś nurt ideologiczny, z którym wprost jest się gotów afiliować, albo czy w którym widzi nadzieję. Bezpośrednio o to pytałeś, ale nie było żadnej bezpośredniej odpowiedzi. A tak no właśnie pytając wprost. No, szczególnie wychodząc z Marsa, który to najlepiej i wydaje mi się, że widzę tam, nie wiem, może po prostu preferowany.
Okay, so it's a question about politics.
What a surprise!
How do you identify politically? Because Hartz is asking the question. He read Mars trilogy and he believes he found the answer there, but it might be it's because it's his politics that he thinks is also reflects upon your politics. But how do you identify politically, and which political current do you think is most hopeful for the future?
I call myself an American leftist, and I leave it at that, because I believe in a united front approach, and everything on the left is good and needs to be allied to the other leftisms. So for me, that includes the Greens. For me, environmentalism and the Green political parties are part of the left. For me, it includes the American tradition of international workers of the world. This is a Pacific Northwest, a kind of a workers' movement out of the American West. And it also includes the New Deal and the mainstream Democratic Party in America, which is a capitalist party. It isn't very left, except when you compare it to the right, and then it's better. So I don't like to make distinctions, especially since I'm a novelist and my characters have opinions, and I want to be able to express my characters' opinions with a full belief in them all across the political spectrum. So, and also there isn't any movement on the left that I think is better than the others. I like Marxist literary criticism, but I'm not a Marxist in the sense that I don't even know what that is in the West. I am an environmentalist, but I think that there needs to be justice, and that the economic system is crucial to how we treat the environment. So if you're an environmentalist, you're an anti-capitalist. And I often define myself as anti-capitalist. So this also means that I'm happy with the word socialist. And I think because of this book fair that it's important to talk about anarchism as the word from Greek means either lack of laws or lack of rulers. And I say it should mean lack of rulers. because I don't think we can live without laws. And I don't believe in the kind of anarchism that says that we could all just be individuals living in our own lives and dealing with each other without a state apparatus. I am a statist. And so I would say to anarchists, it's a kind of a distant horizon. It's a vision of pure equality, very important to keep, almost like a religious point of view. But that the part of anarchy that I am most in support of is the absence of rulers, that every human ought to be equally powerful. And then there ought to be laws that make that the legal situation. So this is my attitude towards anarchism proper. So, I mean, I have my ideas, but I think, also we're in the world we're in right now. So what do you do to express your ideology? It should be more than just a theory or a religion. It should be a praxis. So I look to stepwise action. First, you fight austerity and you fight nationalism, you fight patriarchy, and you fight for diversity. You could talk about social democracy. You could talk about Scandinavia. If all the world ran like Finland, well, that would be capitalist, but it would be better than what we have in America. So then if you got to that, which is already hard, there would be a next step that might be more like true socialism, and more of the anarchistic goals of true equality across the entire society and an end to class distinctions. So this is to describe my politics by way of a kind of a historical plan that maybe stretches out a century or so and tries to stay flexible, tries to avoid the mass extinction event, tries to create more justice. I'm open to anything, but I oppose nationalism, patriarchy, the right wing, the whole imposition of power. I don't like hierarchy. And so from these feelings, I construct a politics.
I have an impression that when you define yourself as a statist, in contrast to anarchists being like, of course, imagining a stateless society, I get an impression that your concept of a state, what a state should look like, or what kind of a state would be better than what we have now, and the concept of lack of state, they are not very far from each other, really. The distinction is quite semantic here, or just, yeah, it's just small difference. And both of those concepts are very far away from where we are now.
Yes, I would agree with you. It is somewhat semantic there. What if every town or county was its own government, or in other words, a radical devolution of power, so there's less imperialism? And I'm also thinking it's very important to remember, and this is great since we're talking to a Polish audience, that languages are important. And if you have a language that is spoken by only 20 million people on Earth, or 50 million, I don't know what the population of Poland is, but some countries it's more like 5 million, and it's their language. And your language is really your culture and your consciousness and your history. So you don't want to lose your language. And one aspect of universalization or of globalization which is English. So that's the British Empire followed by the American Empire. And there always has to be a lingua franca. And the lingua franca, of course, was French. That's why Poland had the connection with France. Everybody in the diplomatic world through the 19th century, they would learn French. That was the lingua franca. And maybe, in Africa, it was Swahili. There have been local and Arabic in the Muslim world. There have been other earlier lingua francas that you would learn to communicate with people who had different national languages, home languages, or mother tongue. And now it's English, and it seems like that's not going to go away because of increasing gains and increasing returns. So I was in Nepal with a Polish couple and a Norwegian couple, and they lived about 200 kilometers apart from each other or whatever, and they were speaking English to each other to understand each other, because you aren't going to learn Norwegian when you're a Pole, and a Norwegian isn't going to learn Polish. You both learn English. So in that's the world situation, and that sort of is a guide for the state. There has to be a dual level. The language level is crucial, and then the lingua franca, the globalization and coordination of all the languages, those two together. And that's one of the reasons that America is so messed up, is that the mother tongue and the lingua franca are the same. So that makes you a monomaniac. When you're monolingual, you're also a monomaniac. You have ideas, you think they're true everywhere. You don't understand the other. There's a provincialism. It's hard to imagine how provincial people are in the United States when you're in Poland and you got the Russians, you got the Germans, you got the rest of Eastern Europe, you got Scandinavia. You're right in the middle of things. The European Union is a big cooperative, etc. To imagine American provincialism, people who've never left the United States, that don't have a passport, that never learned a word of another language, that makes them small. So America is big but small, and that's one of the battles that I have to try to open up the American mind to a more international consciousness.
What do you think is a solution to this kind of contradiction that there has to be a lingua franca, and do you think it shouldn't be a language which is a mother tongue of anyone? Do you think Esperanto is a solution, or maybe not this particular one, but something like that?
I like the impulse of Esperanto. It was a utopian gesture, tried to finesse this problem, but its moment is past. And one thing I'll say about English, and it comes out of England, is the combination of Germanic and Latin, and then the sucking in of borrowed words from all the rest of the world, means that English has a stupendously huge vocabulary, and it has strands. And the scientific world has taken on English and started stuffing it with words that are mostly out of Greek and Latin. And most scientists have no concept of the difference between Greek and Latin. So you get these mashups of new words. And so they're not quite English, they're actually Latin and Greek, they're European. So you get a weird amalgam where if you're going to have a lingua franca, then maybe English is pretty good, but in any case, it's what we've got. And, whole generations, I take it in your country, it's probably like many countries, when you're in elementary school, one of the classes you're going to take in your childhood in order to prepare yourself for the adult world is the English class. Well, that's happening all over the world. And so the momentum is such that if there's ever going to be another lingua franca, I think it's centuries away.
Okay. Any questions? I don't see any questions coming on YouTube. We've got 5 people watching now. We had 8, but I see a question from the audience here.
Czy widzi szansę na jakąś taką rozmianę, jak w nowej książce to jest instytucja, tam w poprzedniej, we wcześniejszej to było okazjonalnie powstanie ludowe, w czym widzi naszą szansę tak w świecie realnym, że coś się zmieni.
So, as it seems in your new book, the tool for social change will be an institution, and in your previous books it was, well, other things, social movements or institutions or legal acts or worldwide meeting of lawyers. What do you think is going to happen in the real world that will bring us to a brighter future?
Well,
is that the question we're supposed to ask? Okay,
yeah. To tell you the truth, I tried to describe what the best course forward in this novel. So although it's organized as a story around a kind of a UN bureaucracy, technocracy, an institution, the novel also describes eyewitness accounts from maybe 20 or 30 individuals around the planet who've seen things happen that they then tell the novel what they saw. So although the ministry is the organizing principle, it's by no means the salvation of the world. In fact, it's shown to be a small clog in a gigantic historical machine, and all the parts have to work. And the interesting question is, could it be that a gear in the middle could help release the pressure so we don't get this horrible gnashing war, famine, disaster, catastrophe, and mass extinction event? The little gears might be helpful in making all this happen with less disaster than is going to happen without them. And so that's the thesis of the novel. But it's almost more of a storytelling organization principle than it is a political principle. Although when I say that, I realize the two are often the same thing. So you'll have to see when you read it what I've done, but it's by no means, the UN saves the world. That can't happen.
Okay. All right, as I can see, we've got 5 minutes left. So if there is any last question anyone would like to ask, because we really have to finish on time today. Any more questions? What in the contemporary world is most inspiring for you, or maybe not inspiring, but a source of hope for the future?
The Paris agreements I've already mentioned, those are important. The young people, the Californian political moment, that California is said to have the 5th biggest economy on the planet all by itself, and that this is a progressive leftist state right now that's intensely multicultural, that doesn't even have a white European majority anymore. That's just one minority amongst many others, Hispanic and Asian mostly, but also South Asian, Vietnamese and Laotian. In other words, California is a kind of a small world in itself, and things are going pretty well. And I live there. So there are problems, particularly homelessness. There are problems created by capitalism itself, that when you run the capitalist machine without extra rules, you get inequality and suffering. And we see that still in California because we're part of the world and it's a capitalist world. So it's not like California is utopia, but it gives me hope to live there because so many different kinds of people are living there together and have decided that the Democratic Party and progressive politics and San Francisco as gender freedom are all working at once together. And it seems to us there that every place on earth could make a similar accommodation and not become like California, but become a juster place, a place with that is working despite all the differences amongst the people there. And there's a tolerance and also a sense of solidarity, which is a word that it comes out of leftist politics, but it also comes out of Poland because of the solidarity movement. And so California is like 100 different languages are spoken in California, and there's nevertheless a sense of solidarity in being a Californian. So it's easy to have a hope but then you look at the rest of the world and realize that we're in a horrible mess. So you have to hold both in your head at the same time. People call me an optimist. I say, just give up on optimism and pessimism. Who cares what you feel? Your feelings aren't important. The historical situation is what's important. You just have to do the necessary things. In India, they talk about doing the needful. You just got to do the needful and then define what the needs are. And the needs are very biological. They're very ecological. They're super basic. So you do the needful and try to scrape through. And that's what this book has been about. And, it's part of a political project, but it's also an attempt to write a novel. And maybe, speaking of novels, There's a great Polish novel that my teacher, Fred Jameson, gave to me long ago to try to teach me more about science fiction. It's called The Doll. In English, it's called The Doll. I think it's by a Prose or Prez. I didn't look up his name in advance.
True.
Yeah, The Doll. Great novel.
Also really reading in Polish school. I didn't
Yeah.
read it.
Well, you ought to read it. It's a science fiction novel because he invents a machine. It's a kind of a robot novel. And so this is early science fiction out of Poland. It's a great novel. And it taught me a lot about 19th century Poland. And this is what literature can do. And I keep coming back to literature. I also read an awful lot of Czesław Miłosz, the poet, more his essays. He moved to Berkeley. He was a Californian, a Polish man who came to California and lived at least 10 years in very near where I live. And his observations on California from the Polish perspective are really good. There's no better writing about California in the 1970s than Miłosz. And I mean, his poetry, once you translate poetry, it's hard to tell what's going on. I believe that poetry is very linguistic and relies on its home language. So I don't know him as a poet, but as an essayist, he's great. And now I have to say I'm reading Olga Tokarczuk. Yeah, well, she's good. And what's interesting is that she's a historical novelist, as far as I can tell, and she's writing very much about Polish history. But because of the translation in English, because of the Nobel Prize, she's become a world writer. And so I think this is one of those solutions to the local language lingua franca, is that you need to express the local so vividly that everywhere in the world people say, oh, well, that's just like me, or we have a similar experience. And I mean, it's Poland's experience. There's nobody else like it. There's no other country that had an experience like that one. Not exactly, and especially not California. But you see people like Miłosz, and you see that, I mean, California does have a very weird history. It's just that it wasn't so impacted by the giants. So I think if you stick to literature, I mean, and you talk about what gives me hope, I'm an English major, which means a literature major. And for me, the novel and people's writing, that's how you realize that everybody's all the same. So, you know, this is a book fair I'm talking to. And so it's kind of preaching to the choir, as they say. But I love books. And I think that people who get involved in the book business, they usually love books, or else they wouldn't do it. It's a tough business. But I wish good luck to everybody. And I want to thank you for this. And on we go in solidarity.
Yeah, Stan, we are out of time, I think.
Yep.
So I would like to thank you so much for joining us. It was super interesting talking to you. It was very much inspiring. Well, I hope there will be a chance to talk again at some point.
That would be good. I mean, that's the way the world works now, and it's great to connect. These little windows are better than I thought they would be. So yeah, say hello to everyone there, and we will talk again. In fact, we should be in contact about, I could send you the book, et cetera, et cetera. So
you should stay in contact.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Goodbye to everybody. I'm off to the lake.
Thanks so much. Bye.